The scream was so faint, no one else heard it, but it was the moment the doctor died. The first scream was so faint it might have been mistaken for the cry of a night bird, thin, wavering, and abruptly cut off. But Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting resting idly in her lap, stiffened at once and whispered, "Oh dear, that wasn't natural at all." The village of Alderwick lay under a soft shroud of mist, the kind that dulled the edges of hedgerows and made lantern light glow like halos in the dark. It was just past 9, the hour when respectable doors were bolted and teacups washed, yet something in the air lingered, an unease, like a held breath that no one had yet released. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, listening, her sharp eyes narrowing behind delicate spectacles. Then, quite deliberately, she set her knitting aside. "Well," she murmured, rising slowly, "if that was Mrs. Dalloway's cat again, it has learned a most peculiar way of expressing itself." A soft sigh, and if it was not, she did not finish the thought. Outside, the gravel crunched faintly beneath her careful steps as she wrapped her shawl more tightly about her shoulders. A faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere a door creaked open, then another. Village instincts, quiet, collective curiosity were stirring. At the far end of Rose Lane stood Dr. Edwin Harrow's house, a handsome, ivy-clad structure with pale windows that gleamed faintly through the mist. It was from that direction the sound had come, and even as Miss Marple made her slow, deliberate way forward, she noticed a flicker of movement, someone slipping hurriedly through the side gate. She said under her breath, pausing just briefly. "That's rather interesting." A figure emerged from the darkness near the hedgerow. Mr. Lionel Pritchard, the grocer, his face flushed and breath slightly uneven. "Miss Marple, did you hear it too?" he asked, his voice lowered, though no one had told him to whisper. "I did indeed," she replied calmly, "though I imagine we shall soon discover more, whether we wish to or not." As if summoned by her words, the front door of Dr. Harrow's house flew open with a sudden bang. A woman stood framed in the doorway, her silhouette trembling against the light behind her. "Help! Someone please, she faltered, pressing a hand to her mouth as though to contain something rising within her. Gasped softly, "My husband, he's not breathing." A ripple passed through the small gathering that had begun to form. Miss Marple's eyes flicked upward, studying the woman carefully. Clara Harrow, the doctor's second wife, was known in the village as polite if somewhat distant. Younger than her husband by nearly 15 years, she had arrived 2 summers ago, trailing whispers behind her like the hem of a dress. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured, moving forward without haste. "Let's not alarm ourselves unnecessarily, though I suspect alarm may already be quite justified." Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of something medicinal, sharp, almost bitter. Dr. Harrow lay slumped in his armchair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, one hand still clutching the armrest as if he had attempted to rise. Edwin, please." Clara's voice trembled as she hovered nearby, her fingers twisting together. Sniffs softly, Miss Marple approached, her movements gentle but purposeful. She did not touch the body immediately. Instead, she looked carefully, thoroughly, her gaze noting the faint discoloration at the man's lips, the untouched glass of sherry on the table beside him, and the small bottle lying uncapped near the hearth. "How long ago did this occur?" she asked quietly. "I don't know exactly," Clara stammered. "I was upstairs, I heard something like a chair scraping, and then—" She swallows hard. "Oh, I thought he'd simply fallen asleep." "Quite," Miss Marple said softly, though her eyes lingered on the bottle. "And before that, did anyone visit your husband this evening?" Clara hesitated, just for a moment too long. No, not that I'm aware of." From the doorway, Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat awkwardly. "Begging your pardon, but I did see someone earlier around dusk. A tall fellow, coat pulled up, couldn't make out his face." Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Curious. A faint ticking sound filled the room, the clock on the mantel, steady and unyielding. Each second seemed louder than the last. Then, quite suddenly, Clara let out a soft, strangled sound and sank into a nearby chair. Whispers. You don't think someone did this?" Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Dr. Harrow, her voice calm but carrying a weight that settled over the room like the mist outside. "My dear Mrs. Harrow," she said gently, "in villages such as ours, things are very rarely as simple as they first appear." And as she spoke, her eyes drifted once more to the uncapped bottle, its label half peeled, its contents faintly glistening in the firelight, and something in her expression shifted ever so slightly, as though a quiet thread had just been pulled, unraveling something much larger beneath the surface. Outside, the mist thickened, curling around the hedges and swallowing the path, while somewhere unseen, a gate creaked softly open, then closed again. The constable arrived with surprising haste, though his boots were still damp with dew and his cap sat slightly askew, as though he had dressed in a hurry and not quite recovered his composure. He paused in the doorway, blinking at the scene before him, then cleared his throat with a small, uncertain cough. "Evening. Rather late for a gathering, isn't it?" he said, attempting a smile that faltered almost immediately when his eyes settled on Dr. Harrow's still form. "Right. Yes, of course." Clear's throat again, firmer this time. "Everyone please remain where you are." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but said nothing. She had already stepped slightly to one side, allowing the constable a clear view, though her own attention had not wavered from the details that others, in their distress, might overlook. Clara Harrow sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts, and every so often she would glance, quickly, almost furtively, toward the small bottle near the hearth as though drawn to it against her will. "Sniffs quietly, Mrs. Harrow," the constable began gently. "I'll need you to tell me exactly what happened." I told you," she replied, her voice thin. "I was upstairs, I heard something, and when I came down," she broke off, pressing her fingers to her lips again. "Whispers, he was like this." "Yes, quite," the constable said, scribbling something into his notebook. "And no one else was in the house." "No." Miss Marple's eyes flicked up at that, just for a fraction of a second, but she remained silent. "Well then," the constable continued, stepping cautiously toward the body. "Dr. Harrow was in good health, I assume? No prior complaints?" "Oh, he was perfectly well," Clara said quickly, too quickly. "He rarely fell ill, hardly ever took his own medicines, if you can believe it." A faint, nervous laugh that died almost instantly, Miss Marple's lips curved ever so slightly, though not in amusement. "How very unusual," she murmured. The constable crouched awkwardly beside the chair, peering at the doctor's face, then at the bottle. This here," he said, pointing. "What is it?" Clara hesitated again. I don't know," she said at last. Miss Marple stepped forward then, her movement quiet but decisive. "If I may," she said, bending slightly to examine the bottle without touching it. "The label has been partially removed, you see, but the residue suggests it once bore a pharmacy mark, likely something prescribed." "Well, that makes sense, doesn't it?" the constable said, relieved. "Doctor's house, after all." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze lingering. "And yet, how curious that it should be left uncapped." A silence followed, thick, pressing. From the doorway, another voice spoke, low and edged with something sharper than concern. "Is it true, then?" All heads turned. Standing there, his coat still damp from the mist, was Mr. Julian Beckwith, the solicitor. His expression was grave, though his eyes moved quickly, taking in every detail with unsettling precision. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, stepping inside. "Though I must admit I did not expect this." A quiet exhale, poor Edwin. "You knew the doctor well?" The constable asked. "Well enough," Beckwith replied. Professionally, at least. His gaze flicked briefly to Clara. I handled certain arrangements for him. Miss Marple watched this exchange with keen interest. Arrangements can be such revealing things, don't you find? She said mildly. Beckwith's lips twitched, almost a smile, though it never quite formed. In my experience, Miss Marple, they often reveal more than people intend. Clara shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening further. I don't see what that has to do with anything, she said, a faint edge creeping into her voice. No, Miss Marple replied gently. Perhaps nothing at all. But her eyes had already moved past Clara, past the solicitor, to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. One drawer stood slightly ajar. Constable, she said softly, may I suggest that we take a closer look around? It would be most unfortunate to overlook something of importance. Yes, quite right, the constable said quickly, eager for direction. He rose, brushing his hands on his trousers, and moved toward the desk. Clara's head snapped up. There's no need for that, she said sharply. Then, realizing her tone, she softened it. I mean, there's nothing there that could help. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying her. One never knows, my dear. The smallest detail can sometimes speak the loudest. The drawer slid open with a soft wooden scrape. Inside lay a collection of neatly arranged papers, receipts, notes, and most notably a folded letter sealed with a deep red wax stamp that had been broken. The constable hesitated. Shall I? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. He unfolded it. A faint rustle filled the room as his eyes moved across the page, and then, quite suddenly, he stopped. A small intake of breath. Well, Beckwith prompted, his voice tight. The constable swallowed. It appears to be a will. Clara made a soft, strangled sound. Gasps. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but something in her posture shifted ever so slightly. And, she asked. The constable glanced up, his expression uncertain. And it's dated only 3 days ago. The clock on the mantel ticked on, steady as ever. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly, deliberately from the letter to Clara Harrow, and then, almost as an afterthought, to the untouched glass of sherry beside the chair. 3 days, she repeated softly. How very timely. Outside, the mist pressed closer against the windows as though listening. And somewhere far down the lane, a dog began to bark once, twice, before falling abruptly silent. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, thin and brittle, as though the very air might crack if anyone dared to speak too loudly. The constable cleared his throat again, though this time it did little to steady him. Well, I suppose we should determine the contents, he said, glancing uncertainly at Miss Marple, as if hoping she might somehow take responsibility for what came next. Quite, she replied, folding her hands neatly before her. Though I imagine the contents will be illuminating. Clara rose abruptly from her chair, the legs scraping sharply against the floor. Gasps softly. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't just read that aloud, it's private. My dear Mrs. Harrow, Beckwith interjected smoothly, stepping closer. As a matter of legal necessity, I'm afraid it may no longer be entirely private. A quiet sigh, particularly under the circumstances. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. She sank back down slowly, her composure fraying at the edges. The constable adjusted his grip on the paper, squinting slightly in the lamplight. Right then, he muttered, and began to read. To whom it may concern, his voice faltered slightly before continuing. I, Edwin Harrow, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments. Miss Marple's gaze drifted, not to the constable, nor to Clara, but to Beckwith. The solicitor stood very still, though a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth betrayed something beneath the surface. And declare this to be my final will, the constable continued. The entirety of my estate, including property, assets, and holdings, is to be transferred to. He stopped. Oh, he said faintly. Well, Miss Marple prompted gently, The constable looked up, his expression now thoroughly unsettled. It names Miss Eleanor Finch." A murmur rippled through the room. "Eleanor Finch," Mr. Pritchard echoed from the doorway. "But she's well, the doctor's former housekeeper," Beckwith finished, his voice low. "Dismissed just last year, if I recall correctly." "Dismissed?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "For reasons that were never entirely clarified," Beckwith said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Clara. Clara's reaction was immediate. "That's absurd," she burst out, her voice cracking. "Eleanor Finch hasn't set foot in this house since. She stopped herself abruptly, her hands trembling. Sniffs sharply. "There must be some mistake." Miss Marple regarded her calmly. "Mistakes do occur," she said, "though rarely in documents of this nature." The constable shifted awkwardly. "There's more," he said, glancing back at the page. "A note appended at the bottom, handwritten." "Go on," Miss Marple said. He swallowed. "It says, 'In the event of my untimely death, this document is to be considered binding and not subject to alteration under any circumstance.'" A faint chill seemed to pass through the room. "Untimely," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "Such a curious choice of words." Clara let out a soft, broken laugh. "You're all looking at me as though I've done something dreadful," she said, her voice wavering. "But I didn't even know about this, I swear it." "Didn't you?" Beckwith said quietly, his gaze sharp now. "No," she insisted, rising again. "Edwin never told me, he never mentioned," she broke off, pressing her hands to her temples. "Oh, this is madness." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Harrow," she said, "may I ask, when was the last time you saw Miss Finch?" Clara hesitated. I don't remember exactly," she said at last. "Months ago, perhaps longer." Miss Marple said softly. At that moment, a sudden knock sounded at the door, 3 quick, uneven raps that seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet. Everyone turned. The constable frowned. "Who on earth?" "I'll see," Mr. Pritchard offered, already moving toward the entrance. The door creaked open, letting in a swirl of cold mist. There was a pause, and then Mr. Pritchard's voice, faint and startled. "Oh." "Well, I never—" "What is it?" the constable called. But before he could answer, a figure stepped into the light. She was tall, her coat damp from the fog, her dark hair pulled back tightly as though to contain something more than mere strands. Her face was pale, but her eyes, sharp, unwavering, moved immediately to the center of the room, to the body, to Clara, and then, finally, to Miss Marple. "I believe," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension that coiled beneath it, "you've all been discussing me." A faint hush fell, deeper than before. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Miss Finch, I presume." Eleanor Finch gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I heard the news," she said, "and I thought it best not to delay." Clara stared at her, her expression a mixture of shock and something darker, something closer to fear. Whispers, "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "On the contrary," she said, "I think this is precisely where I ought to be." Miss Marple watched her closely, her fingers resting lightly against the back of a nearby chair. "And why is that?" she asked. Eleanor's gaze flicked once more to the lifeless figure of Dr. Harrow, then back to Miss Marple. "Because," she said softly, "if what I suspect is true, then Edwin Harrow did not die alone." The clock ticked. No one moved. And somewhere deep within the house, a floorboard creaked, slow, deliberate, as though something unseen had just shifted its weight. The sound of that creak seemed to settle into the bones of the house, low and deliberate, as though it had been waiting, listening before choosing that exact moment to announce itself. Clara's head snapped toward the hallway, her breath catching sharply. "Gasps! Did you hear that?" she whispered. No one answered immediately. Miss Marple, however, had already turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the shadowed corridor beyond the sitting room. "Yes," she said at last, very quietly. "Old houses do speak, you know, though one must always be careful to distinguish between what is merely age and what is something else entirely." The constable shifted uneasily. "There's no one else here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. Harrow said so herself." Alina Finch let out a soft, almost humorless breath. "A faint chuckle, did she?" she murmured. Clara's eyes flashed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Alina replied, stepping further into the room, her damp shoes leaving faint marks on the polished floor, "that Edwin had certain habits. He was not fond of being alone, not truly, even when he claimed to be." Her gaze flicked, just briefly, toward the staircase. "And he did not always dismiss people as completely as others believed." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened at that, though her expression remained mild. "How intriguing." The constable rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, I think it best we have a look just to be sure," he said, gesturing awkwardly toward the hallway. "Mr. Pritchard, would you—" But before he could finish, Alina spoke again. "The study," she said, her voice low. "If you're going to check anywhere, start there." Clara stiffened. "No," she said quickly. "There's nothing in the study, it's locked." Alina tilted her head slightly. "Is it?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze moved between them, noting the tension, the tiny shifts in posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of Clara's jaw. "Locks," she said gently, "can be such unreliable things." The constable hesitated, then nodded. "Right, yes, study it is then." The group moved slowly, almost reluctantly, into the hallway. The air there felt cooler, thinner somehow, carrying a faint scent of polish and something else beneath it, something metallic just on the edge of perception. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her eyes scanning everything. The placement of the rugs, the faint scuff marks near the skirting boards, the way the shadows pooled in the corners where the lamplight did not quite reach. At the end of the corridor stood the study door, dark wood, solid, its brass handle gleaming faintly. The constable reached for it. It turned easily, unlocked. Clara made a small, strangled sound behind them. Whispers, "That's not possible." The door creaked open. Inside, the study was dim, lit only by the spill of light from the hallway. Books lined the walls, their spines neat and orderly, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Then Mr. Pritchard let out a sharp intake of breath. "Good Lord!" There, beside the desk, lay a chair, overturned, one leg splintered slightly as though it had struck something hard. Papers were scattered across the floor, some crumpled, others torn. And near the fireplace, a dark stain marred the carpet. The constable stepped forward slowly, his boots making soft, uneven sounds against the wood. This wasn't mentioned," he said, glancing back at Clara. I didn't come in here," she stammered. "I told you I was upstairs." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, though her attention was fixed on the stain. "And yet something clearly occurred here." Alina moved past them, her expression unreadable as she crouched slightly near the desk. Her fingers hovered over the scattered papers but did not touch. "He argued with someone," she said quietly. "Edwin always did when he felt cornered." A faint exhale, "He hated being confronted." "Confronted about what?" the constable asked. Alina did not answer immediately. Instead, her gaze shifted to the far wall where a small cabinet stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple noticed it at the same moment. "Ah," she murmured, stepping closer. "Now that is interesting." She reached out, gently opening the cabinet door. Inside, several small vials were arranged neatly, labels intact, contents clear or faintly tinted. Medicines, no doubt, but one space, just one, was empty. Miss Marple's eyes lingered there. "Tell me," she said without turning, "was there something kept here that is no longer present?" Clara swallowed audibly. I wouldn't know," she said. Alina, however, gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," she said, "there was." The room seemed to hold its breath. "What was it?" the constable asked. Alina straightened slightly, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "A preparation," she said. "One that Edwin kept very carefully controlled. He never allowed anyone else near it." A brief pause, not after the first incident. Miss Marple turned then, her expression sharpening just a fraction. The first incident? Eleanor's lips pressed together. You didn't know? She asked softly, her gaze flicking to Clara. Clara shook her head too quickly. There was no incident, she said. I would have known. Would you? Eleanor interrupted, her voice still calm but edged now with something colder. You were not here then. Miss Marple stepped slightly between them, her presence quiet but steady. Perhaps, she said gently, we might clarify matters one at a time. She looked back at the empty space in the cabinet, then at the overturned chair, then very slowly toward the hallway beyond. Because, she added softly, it seems increasingly likely that whatever occurred in this room did not remain confined to it. And as if in response, there came another sound, faint, almost imperceptible this time from somewhere deeper within the house. A soft, dragging noise, followed by a pause, then a whisper of movement just out of sight. The dragging sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, as though something heavy was being moved inch by inch across the floor. Stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it pressed against the ears. No one spoke. The constable swallowed audibly. Clears throat, though it comes out strained. Right, well, that settles it. Someone is here. Clara clutched the back of a chair, her knuckles whitening. No, that's impossible, she whispered. There's no one else in this house. There can't be. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, her head tilting as she listened again. You're quite certain of that? She asked, her tone low, almost probing. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had not moved. Her gaze had shifted, not toward the sound, but toward the floor near the cabinet. Something there had caught her attention. A faint line, barely visible, as though something had been dragged from the cabinet toward the hallway. She murmured, bending slightly, her fingers hovering just above the mark without touching it. One does so dislike untidy habits. Miss Marple, the constable said nervously, I really think we should. Yes, she replied calmly, straightening. We should indeed follow it. Follow it, Mr. Pritchard echoed, his voice rising slightly. Into whatever's making that noise. Miss Marple gave him a mild look. My dear Mr. Pritchard, curiosity may not always be comfortable, but it is very rarely avoidable. The dragging sound came once more, closer now. A faint scrape, then a soft thud. Clara let out a sharp breath. Gasps, clutching her chest. Oh, please, someone do something. The constable squared his shoulders, though his hesitation was plain. Right, yes, everyone stay behind me. He stepped into the hallway, his boots sounding louder than before, each step echoing faintly against the walls. The others followed reluctantly, closely, drawn forward by something stronger than fear. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the house. The scent changed too, less of polish now, more of something stale, closed in with a faint metallic edge that lingered at the back of the throat. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the skirting boards again. The faint drag marks continued, leading further in. To the back rooms, she said softly. No, Clara said suddenly, her voice trembling. We don't need to go back there, it's just storage, there's nothing. On the contrary, Eleanor interrupted quietly, I think there may be quite a lot. Clara turned on her, her expression sharp with something bordering on panic. You don't know what you're talking about. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. Don't I? The tension between them seemed to hum, tight, charged, waiting, but the sound came again, cutting through it. A slow, dragging scrape just beyond the next door. The constable stopped. There, he whispered. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible between the frame. No light, no movement, only silence now, heavy, watching. Miss Marple stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, simply with quiet certainty. Her hand rested lightly on the door. For a brief moment, she paused. Listening. Then very gently, she pushed it open. The hinges gave a low, protesting creak. Inside, the room was dim, lit only faintly by a small, high window through which the mist-filtered moonlight seeped in. Shapes emerged slowly, boxes, covered furniture, old trunks stacked unevenly. And there, on the floor, something moved. A figure, half-shadowed. crawling. A soft, broken sound escaped Clara's lips. Whispers, horrified, "No, no." The constable stepped forward sharply. "Stay where you are." He called, though his voice wavered. The figure froze. Then, slowly, painfully, it turned. A face emerged into the pale light, bruised, pale, eyes wide with something between terror and relief. "Help," the figure rasped. Coughs weakly, Miss Marple's breath left her in the faintest of sighs. "Well," she said quietly, "this is most unexpected." Alina stepped closer, her expression shifting, just for a moment, into something unmistakably startled. "Edgar," she said, barely above a whisper. The man's lips trembled. He began, his voice cracking. "She locked me." Clara let out a sudden, sharp cry. "No," she shouted. "Don't listen to him, he's lying, But Miss Marple had already turned. Slowly, deliberately. Her eyes rested on Clara Harrow, calm, steady, and far too knowing. "My dear," she said softly, "I think you may find that the house has begun to speak rather more clearly than you intended." The clock, somewhere distant, struck the hour. And the sound echoed deep, resonant through every corner of the house. The echo of the clock seemed to linger longer than it should have, reverberating faintly through the narrow passage until it dissolved into the same heavy silence that now clung to every wall. No one moved at first. Then Edgar tried to shift. A low groan escaped him as his arm gave way beneath his weight. "Groans quietly, water," he whispered, his voice dry and cracked. "Please." The constable snapped out of his stupor and hurried forward, kneeling awkwardly beside him. "Easy now, steady, what happened to you?" His hands hovered uncertainly, as though afraid the man might break apart under the slightest pressure. Edgar coughed weakly, his chest hitching. "She said I wasn't meant to be here. Coughs, winces, that's enough." Clara cut in sharply, stepping forward with sudden force. "He's delirious, you can't possibly take anything he says seriously." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to her at once. There was something different now, not merely distress, not merely fear, control, or rather the strain of trying to maintain it. "My dear Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem remarkably certain of his condition, given that you insisted no one else was present in the house." Clara faltered, just for a fraction of a second. I meant." She pressed her hands together tightly, her voice rising. "I didn't know he was here, how could I?" "Look at him, he must have broken in." "Broken in?" Alina repeated softly, her eyes narrowing. "And then thoughtfully locked himself in a storage room from the outside." Clara's lips parted. No sound came. The constable shifted his weight, glancing between them. "Now just a moment, let's not jump to conclusions." "Oh, but one must jump somewhere," Miss Marple murmured, stepping forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Clara. "Otherwise one risks remaining quite stationary while the truth moves quietly past." Edgar tried again to push himself upright, his breath catching. "The study," he rasped. "I saw." He stopped, squeezing his eyes shut as though the effort cost him dearly. "He argued with her." A stillness fell. Clara's head snapped toward him. "No," she said, too quickly. "No, you're mistaken, you weren't there, you couldn't have been." "But he was," Alina said quietly. "Wasn't he?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her fingers resting lightly against her chin. "Indeed, that would explain a great deal." The constable looked up sharply. "Explain what?" Miss Marple turned her attention back to the hallway, her gaze tracing the faint drag marks once more. "Why the disturbance began in the study, yet concluded in the sitting room," she said softly. "Why a bottle was left uncapped, and why a glass remained untouched." Clara took a step back. Breathing unevenly, "You're twisting things, this is absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost kind. "Then perhaps you might assist us. You mentioned earlier that your husband rarely took his own medicines." "Yes," Clara said quickly. "That's true, everyone knows that. And yet," Miss Marple continued, her eyes flicking briefly toward Alina, "Miss Finch suggests there was a preparation kept under strict control. one not to be handled lightly. Alina nodded once. He never trusted anyone else with it, she said. Not after, she stopped. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. After, Alina hesitated, then exhaled softly. Sighs after the first incident, she said again. A patient years ago, the dosage was miscalculated. A tragic mistake, Miss Marple asked gently. Alina's lips pressed thin. That's what he called it. The constable frowned. You mean poison? No, Alina said quietly. Not exactly, but in the wrong hands. She let the thought hang. Miss Marple nodded slightly as though a piece had settled into place. And now, she said softly, that same preparation is missing. Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. You have no proof of any of this, none at all. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, turning slowly toward the study. We have rather more than you think. She moved past them, her steps unhurried, her eyes scanning the floor once more. The faint drag marks were clearer now in her mind, more deliberate. Not random, directed. She paused just at the threshold of the sitting room. Tell me, Mrs. Harrow, she said quietly without turning, when you found your husband, you said he was already seated in his chair. Yes, Clara replied quickly. He must have collapsed there. Collapsed, Miss Marple repeated softly. After what appears to have been a struggle in the study. Clara said nothing. Miss Marple turned then, her gaze steady. And yet, she continued, there is no indication that Dr. Harrow walked himself into that chair. A silence followed, heavy, expectant. The constable blinked. You mean he was moved? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Dragged, I think, carefully, but not quite carefully enough. Her eyes dropped briefly to Clara's shoes, to the faint smudge along the sole, barely visible, but there. Clara followed her gaze, and for the first time truly the composure cracked. A small, sharp sound escaped her. Gasps, I know that's not, she faltered, her breath quickening. I didn't. Alina took a slow step forward, her voice low. You didn't what? Clara's hands trembled violently now. I didn't mean, she whispered, her voice breaking. He wasn't supposed to, he wouldn't listen. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes, quiet, observant, missed nothing. Wouldn't listen, she repeated gently. About the will, perhaps. Clara's head jerked up. Too fast, too late. The room seemed to tighten around her, and somewhere, faint but unmistakable, the ticking of the clock began again, steady, patient, as though it had all the time in the world to wait for the truth to finish revealing itself. Clara's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, each one sharper than the last, as though the air itself had turned against her. She glanced from face to face, the constable uncertain and sweating, Mr. Pritchard pale and wide-eyed, Alina still and watchful, and finally Miss Marple, whose calm gaze seemed to settle over her like an unyielding weight. I didn't, Clara began again, but her voice faltered, catching in her throat. Swallows hard. You don't understand, none of you do. Then perhaps you might help us, Miss Marple said gently. Understanding is so much easier when one has the proper details. Clara let out a small, broken laugh that sounded almost like a sob. Details, she whispered. You think this is about details? Alina folded her arms slowly, her voice quiet but edged. I think it's about truth. Clara's head snapped toward her. You have no right to be here, she said, her voice trembling with something darker now. After everything, you have no right to stand there and what? Alina interrupted softly. Watch, listen. She tilted her head slightly. Or remember. The words seemed to land heavily. Miss Marple's eyes flicked between them, catching the subtle shift, the way Clara's expression tightened, the way Alina's gaze held steady, unflinching. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Memory can be such an inconvenient thing, particularly when it belongs to more than one person. The constable shifted again, clearly overwhelmed. Now look here, if there's something that needs saying, I suggest it said plainly. Oh, it will be, Miss Marple replied calmly. In time. She stepped closer to the fireplace, her gaze resting once more on the small, uncapped bottle. The firelight caught its surface, making the liquid within shimmer faintly. "Let us consider," she continued softly, "what we know: a disturbance in the study, a missing preparation, a will altered only days ago, and a husband who, by all accounts, was not inclined to take his own medicine." Clara shook her head rapidly. "No, no, you're twisting everything. He was ill. He must have taken it himself." "But the glass remains untouched," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through Clara's words with quiet precision. "Which suggests he did not choose to take anything at all." A silence followed. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze now drifting to Edgar, who lay propped awkwardly against the wall, his breathing still uneven but his eyes clearer now, watching, listening. "You said you saw an argument," she said to him. Edgar nodded weakly. "Yes, in the study." Winces, he was angry, shouting. "At whom?" the constable asked quickly. Edgar's gaze shifted to Clara. She was there," he whispered. Clara let out a sharp, almost desperate sound. "He's lying," she cried. "He's confused, he doesn't know what he's saying. Don't I?" Edgar murmured faintly, a flicker of something like bitterness crossing his face. "You told him you said he couldn't change it." "That it wasn't fair." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Not fair," she repeated. "An interesting choice of words." Clara's hands flew to her face. "Shaky breath, you don't understand, you can't." "Then explain it," Alina said quietly. Clara lowered her hands slowly, her eyes glistening now not merely with fear but with something deeper, more tangled. "He promised," she said, her voice trembling. "He promised everything would be mine, that I wouldn't have to worry anymore." Sniffs softly. "After everything I gave up for him, everything I endured." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "he changed his mind." Clara's expression twisted. "Because of her," she said, her voice tightening as her gaze flicked toward Alina. "She came back, she started writing to him again, reminding him of things of the past." Alina's brow furrowed slightly. "I wrote once," she said quietly, "to warn him." "To interfere," Clara snapped. "To take back what you thought was yours." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah," she murmured. "So there was something to take back." Alina hesitated, then slowly she spoke. "Before Clara," she said, her voice low, "there was an understanding between Edwin and myself, not formal but not insignificant either. A faint pause when I was dismissed, certain arrangements were left unresolved." The constable blinked. "You mean financial arrangements?" Alina gave a small nod. "Among other things." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The will reflects this." "Yes," Alina said quietly. Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it does," she said. "He always did prefer unfinished business, it gave him something to control." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the back of a chair. "Control," she repeated. "Yes, that seems to be rather central to all of this." She turned then, her gaze settling once more on Clara. "And when control begins to slip," she continued softly, "people often do unexpected things." Clara's breath hitched. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and irreversible. No one spoke. The constable straightened abruptly. "Mrs. Harrow, are you saying—" "I just wanted him to listen," Clara burst out, her voice breaking. "He wouldn't, he kept saying it was done, that it couldn't be changed, that I had to accept it." Her hands tremble violently. "But I wouldn't." Miss Marple watched her quietly. "So you confronted him," she said. "Yes," Clara whispered. "In the study, I told him he had to fix it, that it wasn't right. And when he refused," Clara's eyes filled with tears, I grabbed the bottle, I didn't even think, I just wanted to scare him, to make him understand." Her voice falters. "But he tried to stop me, we struggled," and her voice broke completely. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And the dosage?" she asked softly. Clara shook her head weakly. "I didn't know." "I didn't know how much was too much." A heavy silence followed. Then quietly, "And Edgar?" Miss Marple asked. Clara flinched. I didn't know he was there, she said quickly. He must have been hiding, watching. I panicked, I thought. She swallows hard. I thought he'd tell. So you locked him away, Miss Marple finished gently. Clara said nothing. The truth sat between them now, fully formed, impossible to ignore. The constable exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Well, I suppose that settles. Does it? Miss Marple said softly. The room stilled once more. Clara looked up, confusion flickering through her expression. What do you mean? She asked faintly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once again to the bottle, then to the glass, untouched. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Because, she said quietly, there remains one rather inconvenient detail. The ticking of the clock seemed louder now, sharper, more insistent. Miss Marple turned her head slowly, her voice almost a whisper. If Dr. Harrow did not take the medicine willingly, and if the dosage was, as you say, accidental, she paused, then added, very softly, why, then, is there no trace of it in the glass at all? Clara blinked, her breath catching mid-inhale, as though the question itself had struck her somewhere deep and unguarded. I told you, she stammered, her voice thin and wavering. He must have taken it, perhaps before I came down, perhaps he— But you said you found him already seated, Miss Marple replied gently, her tone unhurried, almost soothing. And the glass remains precisely as it was, undisturbed, untested. She stepped closer to the small table, bending slightly, her eyes fixed on the faint line of dust around the base of the glass. Not even the slightest shift. The constable frowned, leaning in as well. You're certain of that? Oh yes, Miss Marple said softly. One grows quite accustomed to noticing such things. A faint pause, particularly in villages. Alina crossed her arms more tightly, her gaze narrowing. Then if he didn't drink it, she murmured, how did it enter his system? Edgar let out a weak cough from the hallway. Cough's voice strained, injection, maybe he kept syringes. Miss Marple's head turned slightly toward him, her eyes sharpening with interest. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, he would have, wouldn't he? Clara's face drained of what little color remained. No, she whispered. No, that's not, You didn't administer anything, Miss Marple asked gently. I only grabbed the bottle, I swear. Clara's hands trembled violently now. He was shouting, we were struggling, I didn't. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her gaze thoughtful. Struggles are rarely tidy affairs, she said, and yet there is something rather tidy about this. Tidy, the constable echoed. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Indeed, the bottle uncapped, the glass untouched, the body moved with some care, and yet, her eyes drifted back toward the study. The study itself tells a rather different story. Alina stepped closer. You mean the struggle? Yes, Miss Marple said. A genuine one, I think, heated, unexpected. A slight tilt of her head, but not completed. A silence followed. Clara stared at her, confusion and fear flickering together. I don't understand what you're implying. No, Miss Marple said softly. Then perhaps we should consider the timing. She moved slowly toward the doorway, her voice calm but carrying. Dr. Harrow argues with you in the study. There is a struggle. A bottle is involved, perhaps even opened in the heat of the moment. She paused, glancing briefly at the faint stain on the carpet. But he does not die there. Clara's lips parted. Miss Marple continued. Instead, he is later found in the sitting room, placed, not fallen. And by that time, whatever caused his death has already taken effect. The constable shifted uneasily. So you're saying, that he was poisoned after the argument? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied gently, that the argument alone may not account for everything. Alina's gaze sharpened. Then someone else must have been involved, Miss Marple finished quietly. The words settled over the room like a chill. Clara shook her head rapidly. No, that's ridiculous. There was no one else. Wasn't there? Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but there was something firmer beneath it now. Mr. Pritchard mentioned seeing a visitor at dusk, a tall figure, coat pulled up. All eyes turned to him. Mr. Pritchard blinked, startled. Well, yes, but I couldn't see the face, just a shape, really. Even so, Miss Marple said, it is rather inconvenient to ignore such details. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Edwin wasn't expecting anyone tonight, she said slowly. At least not that I knew of. Miss Marple glanced at her. And yet the will was changed only 3 days ago, she murmured. And a letter opened left upon the desk. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the study. One wonders what it contained. The constable shifted his weight. We didn't read that letter fully, just the will. No, Miss Marple agreed. And I think perhaps we should. Clara's head snapped up. No, she said sharply. That has nothing to do with, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. Everything has something to do with everything else in the end. She turned and moved back toward the study, her steps measured, her expression thoughtful. The others followed, drawn once more into that dim, unsettled space. The desk still stood as they had left it, the scattered papers unmoved, the broken order lingering like an echo of what had occurred. Miss Marple reached for the folded letter, lifting it carefully. The paper crackled faintly as she opened it. Her eyes moved across the page. Once, then again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound escaped her. A soft inhale. Well, she murmured. What is it? The constable asked quickly. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned the letter slightly, allowing the lamplight to fall more clearly across the ink. This, she said quietly, is not merely correspondence. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression intent. What do you mean? Miss Marple looked up. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately across the room, to Clara, to the constable, to Mr. Pritchard, and then it settled. Because, she said softly, it appears that Dr. Harrow was being warned. A stillness fell. Warned, the constable repeated. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, about someone in this very house. Clara let out a sharp, strangled sound. Gasps, Eleanor's eyes narrowed. About whom? Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the edge of the paper. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm, almost too calm. That, she said, is precisely what we must now determine. And somewhere, faint but unmistakable, the dragging sound returned. Softer now, almost like a whisper against the floorboards, though no one could quite tell from where. The sound did not belong. That was the first thing Miss Marple realized. It was too light now, too faint to be the strained effort of a wounded man. More like fabric brushing wood or a careful footstep dragged just enough to avoid notice. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she folded the letter once more with quiet precision as though nothing at all were amiss. Curious, she murmured, almost absently. The others, however, had heard it too. The constable stiffened. There it is again, he whispered, his voice dropping instinctively. But Edgar's here, so who? Eleanor's gaze had already shifted to the doorway. Someone who doesn't wish to be seen, she said quietly. Clara shook her head, backing slightly toward the desk. No. No, this is nonsense. There's no one else. Miss Marple lifted her eyes then, her voice soft but very clear. My dear Mrs. Harrow, she said, you are quite right about one thing. Clara froze. This is nonsense, Miss Marple continued gently, because the house has already revealed more than it intended. She tilted her head slightly. One simply has to listen properly. The dragging sound came again, closer, just beyond the study door. The constable moved quickly this time, stepping into the hallway. Who's there? He called, though his voice wavered. No answer, only the faint whisper of movement. Miss Marple followed, unhurried, composed, her eyes already scanning the floor, the walls, the spaces where shadows gathered unnaturally. And then she saw it. Not a person, not directly, but a reflection. In the narrow glass of a framed picture hanging crookedly on the wall, a sliver of movement behind them, just out of sight. Ah, she said softly. The constable turned. What? But Miss Marple was already stepping aside, just enough to reveal the space behind the half-open linen cupboard door. It moved, very slightly. then stilled. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Whoever you are, you'd best come out." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked, slowly, deliberately, and a figure emerged, tall, coat still on, collar turned up, face pale beneath the dim light. Mr. Julian Beckwith, the solicitor. He blinked as though adjusting to being seen, then gave a small, breathy exhale. Cleared his throat softly. "Well," he said, attempting composure, "this is rather awkward." The constable stared. "You, what in heaven's name are you doing hiding in a cupboard?" Beckwith straightened his coat, brushing imaginary dust from the sleeve. "I wasn't hiding," he said smoothly. "Merely observing." "Observing?" Eleanor repeated, her tone sharp. "Yes," Beckwith said, his eyes flicking briefly, too briefly, toward Miss Marple. "Likes to be certain of matters before intervening." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "How very prudent." Clara stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to something far more unsettled. "Julian," she whispered, why are you here like this?" Beckwith's gaze met hers for a fraction of a second. Something passed between them, quick, tense, then gone. "I might ask you the same," he replied lightly. "Given the circumstances." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Yes," she said softly. "Given the circumstances, your presence here is most illuminating." The constable frowned. "Illuminating how?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her hands lightly folded. "Because," she said gently, "we now have our second visitor." Beckwith's expression did not change, but something in his posture tightened. "I was not aware," he said evenly, "that visiting a client's home was a crime." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not at all." A faint pause, but hiding in cupboards tends to invite questions. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "I had my reasons." "I'm sure you did," Miss Marple said. "In fact, I suspect they are rather closely tied to this letter." She held it up slightly. Beckwith's eyes flicked to it, there, a reaction small but unmistakable. The constable noticed it too. "You've seen that before, haven't you?" Beckwith hesitated, just a moment too long. "I may have," he said. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And I imagine you might also recognize the handwriting, other than Dr. Harrow S." Eleanor stepped closer. "You mean it wasn't all written by him?" Miss Marple shook her head faintly. "No, the main body, yes, but the warning," she tapped the lower portion of the page lightly. "That was added later, different ink, slightly different pressure." The room seemed to tighten again. "Who wrote it?" the constable asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Beckwith and waited. He exhaled slowly. "Sighs, just barely. You always did have a talent for detail, Miss Marple." "Only when it is necessary," she replied gently. A silence stretched. Then Beckwith gave a faint, resigned nod. "I added it," he said. Clara gasped. But why would you?" "To protect him," Beckwith said quietly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "From whom?" Beckwith's gaze shifted to Clara, and then very deliberately to Miss Marple. But it was Miss Marple who spoke, softly, calmly. "With respect," she said, "I think the more relevant question is—" She paused. The ticking of the clock echoed faintly down the corridor. "Whether you were protecting him," her eyes sharpened just slightly, "or protecting something else entirely." And in that moment, the air seemed to shift again, subtly, unmistakably, as though the truth, which had been circling patiently, had just taken one step closer. Beckwith's composure did not shatter, it never would, not entirely, but it shifted just enough for Miss Marple to notice. A tightening at the jaw, a pause too long before the next breath, the sort of thing most people would miss entirely. "I assure you," he said evenly, "my only concern was Dr. Harrow's well-being." "Of course," Miss Marple replied softly, though her eyes did not leave his face. "And yet you chose to remain unseen." "A precaution," he said, "given the volatility of the situation." Clara let out a small, unsteady laugh. Laughs weakly. "Volatility, you mean me, don't you?" Her voice trembled. "You think I did all of this?" I think, Miss Marple said gently, cutting across her words, that you did rather more than you intended, but perhaps not everything that occurred this evening. The room stilled. The constable blinked. You mean she's not the only one responsible? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her fingers smoothing its edges. Responsibility is rarely so conveniently singular, she said, particularly in matters involving money and fear and secrets that have been waiting rather a long time to be uncovered. Aliner's gaze flicked between them. Then say it plainly, she said. Who else? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned slowly, her eyes drifting back toward the study, the overturned chair, the scattered papers, the faint stain darkening the carpet. A struggle occurred here, she said quietly. That much is clear. Mrs. Harrow confronted her husband. The bottle was taken, perhaps opened in haste, but she paused, glancing back toward the sitting room. He did not die here. Clara shook her head weakly. I told you I didn't know what I was doing. No, Miss Marple said softly. I believe you didn't. Clara blinked. The words seemed to land differently this time. The constable frowned. Then how did he? Miss Marple's gaze lifted again, settling deliberately on Beckwith. Because, she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm, someone else ensured that he would not recover from it. A silence fell, heavy, pressing. Beckwith did not move, but his eyes sharpened. That is a rather serious accusation, he said calmly. Not an accusation, Miss Marple replied. An observation. Aliner stepped forward slightly, her voice low. You're saying he finished what Clara started. Miss Marple inclined her head faintly. Something very like that, yes. Clara stared at Beckwith, her expression unraveling. No, that's not true, you weren't even. Oh, but he was, Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Pritchard saw a visitor at dusk, and I suspect Mr. Beckwith arrived rather earlier than he claimed with business that could not wait. Beckwith exhaled softly. A faint sigh. You do have a remarkable way of arranging events to suit your conclusions. Miss Marple smiled faintly. On the contrary, I find it far more effective to allow events to arrange themselves. She stepped closer now, her voice lowering just slightly. You knew about the will, she said. You prepared it, you witnessed the change, and you understood better than anyone that it would leave Mrs. Harrow quite entirely without what she expected. Beckwith said nothing. Miss Marple continued. You also knew about the earlier incident, the miscalculation, the preparation your client kept under lock and key. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the cabinet, and the consequences of using it incorrectly. Aliner's brow furrowed. So he knew it could kill. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, but more importantly, he knew how much it would take. The constable inhaled sharply. You mean he adjusted the dose? Miss Marple turned her head slightly. I think it very likely. Clara's voice came out in a whisper. Shaking, no, Julian, you would. Beckwith's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time something cracked. Not panic, not quite, but something colder, more calculating. You're forgetting something, he said quietly. If I had intended to harm Dr. Harrow, why remain here at all? Why risk being discovered? Miss Marple tilted her head. Ah, she said, now that is an excellent question. A pause, then, because, she continued softly, you weren't waiting to escape. Her eyes held his. You were waiting to see whether your intervention had been sufficient. The words seemed to settle into the room like dust after a fall. Aliner's breath caught. Soft gasp, you stayed to make sure he died. Beckwith's jaw tightened. And if he hadn't, Miss Marple pressed gently, you had the means to ensure that he would. The constable stepped forward, his voice firmer now. Mr. Beckwith, I think you'd better explain yourself. But Beckwith did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Miss Marple. You're very certain, he said. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. No, she replied, not certain. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Merely observant. She gestured lightly toward the sitting room. The glass, she said, untouched, which tells us the preparation was not administered in the obvious way. Her eyes shifted back to him. But you are a solicitor, Mr. Beckwith, a man accustomed to precision, to control. A faint pause, and to ensuring that outcomes are definitive. The clock ticked. Loud, unforgiving, Beckwith's fingers curled slightly at his side. You assume a great deal, he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not at all. She took one small step closer. And yet there is one final detail. His eyes flickered just briefly. What detail? He asked. Miss Marple's gaze dropped to his coat sleeve, to a faint, almost invisible mark near the cuff, a pale smudge, barely there, but not dust, not quite. Residue, she said softly. From the cabinet, perhaps, or from handling something that should have been left untouched. Beckwith's breath slowed. Measured, controlled, but not quite steady. And more importantly, Miss Marple added, her voice quiet as a whisper, you were the only one in this house tonight who understood exactly how to make it appear accidental. A silence followed, deep, unbroken. Then Beckwith gave a small, almost imperceptible laugh. A quiet exhale, almost a chuckle. Well, he said softly, this is becoming rather complicated. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Oh no, she replied gently. It's only just beginning to become clear. And somewhere in the house, the faintest creak sounded again, not of movement this time, but of something long hidden beginning at last to give way. Beckwith's faint smile lingered for just a moment too long, thin, controlled, and entirely without warmth, before it slipped away, leaving something colder behind. Clear, he repeated softly, as though tasting the word. You believe you've made it clear. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the edge of the letter in her hand, aligning it neatly as though tidiness itself might coax the truth into fuller shape. One rarely makes things clear, Mr. Beckwith, she said gently. One simply allows them to be seen. The constable shifted closer now, his unease giving way to a firmer sort of resolve. I think you'd better tell us exactly what you were doing here tonight, he said, his voice more steady than before. Beckwith glanced at him, then back at Miss Marple. For a moment it seemed he might continue to deflect, but then he exhaled. Sighs softly. Very well, he said. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling. Julian, he did not look at her. I came because Dr. Harrow requested it, he said evenly. He was unsettled about the will, about Miss Finch's reappearance, about certain matters he believed had not been properly concluded. Aliner's expression tightened. You mean the arrangement he tried to bury? Beckwith's gaze flicked to her briefly. I mean, he said carefully, that there were obligations he had long neglected. Miss Marple nodded faintly, and he wished to correct them. Yes, at some personal cost, she added softly. Beckwith gave a small, humorless smile. Naturally. Clara shook her head, her voice rising again. He was confused, he didn't know what he was doing. No, Beckwith said quietly, finally turning to her. He knew exactly what he was doing. The words struck. Clara flinched as though slapped. He intended to leave you with nothing, Beckwith continued, his tone measured, almost clinical. That was quite clear. A silence followed. Clara's lips trembled. Whispers, you told me it could be contested. Beckwith's expression did not change. I told you it would be difficult. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And difficulty can sometimes encourage alternative solutions. Beckwith did not respond. Miss Marple continued, You arrived, you spoke with him. You knew of his decision, and then at some point the argument occurred. Clara shook her head weakly. I didn't know he was here, I swear I didn't. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. Clara blinked, startled. But he knew you were, Miss Marple added, her gaze shifting back to Beckwith, and he chose not to reveal himself immediately. Aliner's brow furrowed. Why would he do that? Miss Marple's voice softened. Because he was listening. The room stilled. Beckwith's jaw tightened again, only slightly, but enough. You heard the argument, Miss Marple said quietly. Every word, the desperation, the threat implied if not spoken. Clara let out a small, broken sound. Sniffs, and when the struggle occurred, Miss Marple continued, you did not intervene. No, Beckwith said. The admission was quiet, flat. The constable stiffened. You just stood by. I observed, Beckwith replied. Alina stared at him. While he. Yes, Beckwith said, his voice sharper now. Because at that moment it was not yet final. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Not yet. A pause. Then Beckwith continued more slowly. When the struggle ended, Dr. Harrow was still alive, disoriented perhaps, weak but alive. Clara covered her mouth. Soft gasp, and you entered the room, Miss Marple said. Yes, and you saw the opportunity. Beckwith did not deny it. The silence stretched. He was going to undo everything, Beckwith said at last, his voice lower now, more controlled. Not just for her. His gaze flicked toward Clara, but for himself, years of arrangements, carefully managed expectations. A faint breath, it would have caused complications. Miss Marple tilted her head. For whom? For everyone, he said quickly, but Miss Marple's eyes held his. Or perhaps, she said softly, for you. Beckwith's lips pressed thin. You had a great deal tied to Dr. Harrow's affairs, did you not? She continued. Investments, discreet transactions, matters best left undisturbed. Alina's eyes widened slightly. You mean he wasn't just his solicitor? Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Oh no, I think he was rather more than that. The constable stepped closer. Are you saying there was fraud? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she looked at Beckwith. You understood, she said quietly, that if Dr. Harrow lived, he might begin to talk. Beckwith's silence was answer enough. And so, Miss Marple went on, you ensured that he would not. Clara shook her head violently. No, Julian, tell them that's not true. Beckwith did not look at her. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat pocket. The constable tensed immediately. Now just a moment, what are you? Beckwith withdrew his hand. Empty. He held it up slightly as though to show there was nothing concealed. Relax, he said quietly. If I intended to run, I would have done so already. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on him. No, she said softly, you wouldn't. A faint pause. Because, she added, you believed you had accounted for everything. Beckwith's eyes flickered. Almost everything. The word hung, unfinished. Unsettling, the constable frowned. What do you mean, almost? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned, slowly, her gaze drifting back toward the sitting room, to the chair, to the body, to the small, uncapped bottle beside it. And then her eyes moved to Edgar, still weak, still watching, still alive. A faint, knowing expression touched her lips. Because, she said quietly, there is still one witness whose presence was never part of your calculation. The room fell silent once more. Beckwith's gaze shifted to Edgar. And for the first time there it was, not control, not calculation, but something sharper, more dangerous, a flicker of realization. And just as quickly, something else, decision. That flicker, so quick it might have passed unnoticed by anyone less attentive, was enough. Miss Marple saw it. And in the same instant she understood that whatever delicate balance had held the room together was about to break. Constable, she said softly, without raising her voice, I think it would be wise, but Beckwith moved. Not with panic, not with haste, but with a sudden, precise intention that made it all the more alarming. His hand darted, not toward the door, not toward escape, but toward the small cabinet in the study, the one that still stood ajar. Stop! The constable shouted, lunging forward. Too late. Beckwith's fingers brushed the edge of the cabinet door, pushing it open wider. Inside, the neat row of vials trembled slightly as his hand hovered over them. Don't be absurd, Beckwith said sharply, his composure cracking at last. If you think I'll stand here and allow what? Miss Marple interrupted, her tone still gentle, though there was steel beneath it now. The truth to be spoken. His eyes flashed toward her. For a moment everything stilled. Then Alina moved, faster than anyone expected. She stepped between Beckwith and the cabinet, her hand snapping out to slam the door shut with a sharp crack. No, she said, her voice low and unwavering. You don't get to control this anymore. Beckwith froze. The moment hung tight, fragile. Then the constable reached him, gripping his arm firmly. "That's quite enough of that," he said, breathless but resolute. "You're not touching anything else." Beckwith did not struggle. Instead, he let out a slow breath. Sighs long and measured. "Well," he murmured, almost to himself, "that was unfortunate." Clara let out a trembling sob. Sniffs, voice breaking. "What were you going to do?" He did not answer her. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze steady. "You see," she said quietly, "there is something rather telling about a man's instincts when he believes himself cornered." Beckwith's eyes lifted to hers. "And yours," she continued, "was not to run but to finish something." A pause, the clock ticked, slow, relentless. Alina crossed her arms, her voice tight. "You were going to use another vial." Beckwith gave a faint, humorless smile. "One does prefer certainty." The constable tightened his grip. "Certainty of what?" Miss Marple answered. "Of silence," she said softly. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Edgar. "And of removing the one remaining voice that could contradict your version of events." Edgar swallowed weakly, his gaze fixed on Beckwith now. "Whispers, you came back for me." Beckwith did not deny it. Instead, he looked at him coolly, almost clinically. "You were not meant to be involved," he said. Alina let out a sharp breath. "Not meant to be involved," she repeated. "You locked him away, left him there like he was nothing." "A complication," Beckwith said. The word fell cold. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "And yet," she said gently, "complications have a way of persisting." The constable shifted, his voice firm now. "Mr. Beckwith, I think you'd better come along quietly." Beckwith glanced at him, then back at Miss Marple. For a moment, something almost like amusement flickered across his face again, faint, restrained. "You've constructed a very neat narrative," he said. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Oh no," she replied. "You did that yourself." A pause, then she added, "I merely listened." Clara sank slowly into a chair, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I only wanted him to change it. I didn't think—" "No," Miss Marple said gently, turning toward her. "You didn't think beyond the moment, and someone else did." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Soft sob, "I killed him." Miss Marple's expression softened just slightly. "I think," she said carefully, "that you began something that you did not fully understand." She glanced toward Beckwith. "And that someone else ensured its conclusion." The constable nodded grimly. "Both of you will need to answer for this." Clara flinched. Beckwith said nothing. The house, at last, seemed to exhale. The tension that had coiled through its halls began, slowly, to loosen, though the air still carried the weight of what had been uncovered. Miss Marple moved back toward the sitting room, her steps unhurried, her gaze thoughtful once more. She paused beside the chair where Dr. Harrow lay, her eyes resting briefly on the still figure. "Such a pity," she murmured softly. "So many careful arrangements undone in a single evening." Behind her, the constable's voice echoed faintly as he began to guide Beckwith toward the door. Alina remained where she was, watching, and Clara sat very still, her quiet, uneven breaths the only sound she made. Miss Marple glanced once more at the small, uncapped bottle, then at the untouched glass, and then very faintly she smiled, because even now there were still details, small ones, waiting, and Miss Marple, as always, had no intention of overlooking them. The smile did not last. It rarely did with Miss Marple. It faded almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by that familiar, thoughtful stillness, like someone who has noticed a thread just slightly out of place in an otherwise neat piece of stitching. "Constable," she said quietly, though she did not turn. "Yes," he replied, pausing mid-step with Beckwith still firmly in his grasp. "I wonder," she continued, her voice light, almost conversational, "if you might delay your departure just a moment longer." The constable hesitated. "We've got enough here to proceed, surely." "Oh, quite," Miss Marple said gently. "More than enough, one might think." A faint pause, and yet, she turned then, slowly. Her eyes moved from Beckwith to Clara to Alina and finally back to the small table beside the chair. To leave things almost explained, she murmured, is rather like leaving a teacup half-washed, perfectly functional but not, I think, entirely satisfactory. Alina frowned slightly. What's missing? Miss Marple stepped closer to the table again, her fingers hovering just above the surface. The glass, she said. Clara let out a weak, incredulous breath. Whispers, not that again. Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. That again. She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing. Because if Mr. Beckwith ensured the final dose, and if you, my dear, initiated the first, then one must ask, her gaze lifted. Why was the glass placed here at all? A silence followed. The constable blinked. Well, I assumed it was meant to make it look like he drank it. Precisely, Miss Marple said, which suggests intent. Beckwith's grip on composure tightened again, almost imperceptibly. Clara shook her head weakly. I didn't put it there, I swear I didn't even touch it. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, I believe you. Clara froze. You do. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, because if you had placed it, you would have ensured it appeared convincing. Alina tilted her head. What do you mean? Miss Marple gestured lightly. The position, the angle, the lack of any residue on the rim, it is staged, but rather poorly. The constable frowned. So someone else put it there. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed. All eyes turned to Beckwith. He did not move, but something in his gaze flickered again, brief, sharp. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Yes, that would be the obvious conclusion. Beckwith's lips curved faintly. You've already decided I'm responsible for everything else, he said. Why not that as well? Miss Marple smiled very slightly. Because, she said, you are not careless. A pause, the words hung unexpected. Beckwith's expression shifted just enough. Alina frowned. Then if not him, Miss Marple turned, slowly. Her gaze moved past them all, to the doorway, to the corridor, and then to Mr. Pritchard, who had been very quiet, very still for quite some time. Oh, Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Pritchard blinked, startled. I what? Miss Marple's eyes rested on him with gentle interest. My dear Mr. Pritchard, she said, you have been most helpful this evening. Well, happy to assist, of course, he stammered, his hands fidgeting. Clears throat nervously, just doing my part. Quite, Miss Marple said, and you arrived rather promptly. I heard the scream, he said quickly. Came straight away, anyone would. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, anyone would. A pause. Then, and yet, she continued softly, you were already outside, were you not? The room stilled. Mr. Pritchard's smile faltered. I was just passing, Miss Marple repeated gently. At that hour. I often take evening walks in the opposite direction of your home, she asked. He stopped, just for a second, but it was enough. The constable's grip on Beckwith loosened slightly as his attention shifted. Now just a moment, Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice still mild. You mentioned seeing a visitor earlier, she said. A tall figure, coat pulled up. Yes, that was him, Pritchard said quickly, nodding toward Beckwith. I told you, did you? Miss Marple asked softly, a pause. I believe, she continued, you said you could not see the face. Pritchard swallowed. Sniffs, nervous, well, no, but I assumed. Assumptions can be so dangerous, Miss Marple said. Alina's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? Miss Marple's gaze did not leave Pritchard. I am saying, she replied quietly, that we have perhaps overlooked someone who has been most conveniently present at every stage of this evening. The constable turned fully now. Mr. Pritchard, where exactly were you before you came here? Pritchard laughed too quickly. Forced chuckle, I told you I was walking, just happened to hear. And the glass? Miss Marple asked gently. He blinked. What about it? You are a grocer, she said. You handle bottles, liquids. You understand how things are poured, how they settle, how residue behaves. A silence fell. Pritchard's fingers twitched. Miss Marple took one small step closer. And you arrived early enough, she continued, to see more than you admitted. I don't know what you're implying. No, she said softly, her eyes sharpened. Then perhaps you can explain why the glass bears the faintest trace of something quite different from the contents of that bottle. The room seemed to tighten again. The constable frowned. Different how? Miss Marple did not look away from Pritchard. Diluted, she said quietly. A pause. Altered. Pritchard's breath caught just slightly, but enough. And more importantly, Miss Marple added, her voice barely above a whisper now, placed there after everything else had already occurred. No one moved. No one spoke. Then very softly Mr. Pritchard exhaled. Shaky breath and something in his expression changed. The change was subtle, so subtle that anyone less accustomed to watching people might have missed it entirely. But Miss Marple did not miss such things. A softening at the edges of Mr. Pritchard's expression, not relief, no, but something like resignation, as though a long-held tension had finally begun to loosen. Well now, he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual bustling cheerfulness. You are a remarkable lady, Miss Marple. The constable straightened at once. Mr. Pritchard, I think you'd better explain yourself right now. Pritchard gave a small nod. Clara's throat more subdued now. Yes, I suppose I had better. Clara stared at him, her confusion deepening. You, what could you possibly? Oh, I imagine quite a lot, Alina murmured under her breath. Miss Marple remained still, her hands lightly folded, her gaze attentive but not unkind. Take your time, she said gently. Pritchard let out a long breath. Sighs, I didn't come here by accident, he admitted. Not tonight. The words settled heavily. I had business with the doctor, he continued. Private business. The constable frowned. What sort of business? Pritchard hesitated, then gave a small, bitter smile. The sort that respectable men prefer not to discuss. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Ah, she said softly. Debts, perhaps. Pritchard's eyes flicked to her. Something like that. Alina crossed her arms. You mean he had something on you? Pritchard let out a faint, humorless chuckle. You might say that. Edwin Harrow was very good at collecting information. Sniffs lightly and even better at using it. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, that does seem to be a recurring theme. Clara's voice trembled. I don't understand, what does this have to do with? Everything, Miss Marple said quietly. Pritchard shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the sitting room. I arrived earlier than I said. Before the shouting started. Beckwith's eyes narrowed slightly, watching him now with renewed interest. I let myself in through the side gate, Pritchard continued. Didn't want to make a scene. A faint pause, I heard voices from the study. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And you listened? Yes, Clara closed her eyes briefly. Whispers, oh no, I heard enough, Pritchard said. Enough to know things weren't going well. He swallowed. And then the struggle, I heard that too. The room seemed to tighten again. But you didn't go in, the constable said. Pritchard shook his head. No, I stayed where I was, thought it best not to get involved. Beckwith let out a faint, dry laugh. Quiet chuckle, how prudent of you. Pritchard shot him a quick glance, then looked away. After a while it went quiet, he said. Too quiet, so I went a look. Miss Marple did not interrupt, she simply listened. He was on the floor, Pritchard said softly. In the study, breathing, but not right, and he nodded faintly toward Clara. She wasn't there anymore. Clara's hands trembled. I went upstairs, I didn't. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. You left him there. Pritchard continued. I panicked, thought this might be my chance. The constable blinked. Your chance for what? To settle things, Pritchard said. To make sure he couldn't use anything against me again. Alina's voice hardened. So you finished it? No, Pritchard said quickly, shaking his head. No, I didn't touch him, I swear it, he was already fading. Swallows hard, but I knew what it would look like, what it could look like. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And so you arranged it? Pritchard nodded weakly. I moved him into the sitting room, thought it would seem more natural. a faint, shaky breath like he'd collapsed there. "And the glass," Miss Marple prompted softly. Pritchard looked down at his hands. "I poured a little from one of the other bottles, not the same one. Something harmless, just enough to make it look like he'd been drinking." The constable stared. "You staged the scene." "Yes. And the bottle?" Miss Marple asked. "I left it," Pritchard said. "Didn't dare touch that one, didn't know what was in it. Sniffs, didn't want to risk making things worse." Beckwith watched him silently, his expression unreadable. "And then?" Miss Marple asked. "I heard someone else coming," Pritchard said. "So I slipped out, waited, and when the scream came, I came back like I'd just arrived." A long silence followed. The truth, layered, tangled, hung in the air. Clara sat motionless, her face pale with shock. You moved him," Pritchard nodded faintly. "I thought it would protect me." A bitter exhale, "Didn't think it would complicate everything else." Miss Marple gave a small, almost sympathetic sigh. "Complications do have a way of accumulating," she said. The constable ran a hand over his face. "So let me get this straight," he muttered. "One starts it, another finishes it, and a third rearranges it." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "A rather crowded affair, wouldn't you say?" Alina let out a quiet breath. "And all of it for control." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Control, fear, and the desire to avoid consequences." Her gaze moved slowly across them all. Clara, Beckwith, Pritchard, 3 separate choices, 3 separate moments, each feeding into the next. "And yet," she added quietly, "none of them considered that someone might be watching or listening or simply paying attention." The clock ticked on, steady, unyielding. The constable straightened, his voice firm now. "I think that's quite enough for one evening. Mr. Beckwith, Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Hare. I'll need all of you to come with me." Clara let out a soft, broken sound. "Whispers, I never meant." Beckwith said nothing. Pritchard lowered his head. Alina stood still, her arms slowly uncrossing, her gaze distant. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned once more toward the quiet room, her eyes resting briefly on the place where everything had come undone. "Such a great many intentions," she murmured softly, "and not a single one of them quite as simple as it seemed." Outside, the mist had begun to thin, curling away from the hedgerows as though the village itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. But inside the house, the echoes remained. And Miss Marple, as always, listened. Miss Marple did not move immediately. Even as the constable began the slow, awkward process of gathering his 3 very different suspects, Clara trembling, Beckwith composed once more behind a carefully rebuilt mask, and Pritchard subdued and hollow-eyed, Miss Marple remained where she was, her gaze resting not on the people but on the room itself. Something still tugged at her, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. Like a thread that refused to lie flat. "Constable," she said softly. He paused mid-motion. "Yes, Miss Marple. I wonder," she continued, her tone mild, "if we might delay just one moment longer." The constable let out a faint, weary breath. "Sighs, Miss Marple, with all due respect, I think we've uncovered quite enough for one evening." "Oh, yes," she agreed gently. "Quite enough to proceed." A slight pause, but not, I think, quite enough to understand. Alina glanced at her, her brow furrowing. "There's more." Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she stepped slowly toward the chair once more, the place where Dr. Harrow had been found, the small table, the glass, the bottle, everything exactly as it had been. Everything except, "Ah," she murmured. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. The constable frowned. "What is it now?" Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. "The chair," she said. Clara looked up weakly. "What about it?" Miss Marple reached out, gently, carefully, and touched the back of the armchair, her fingers tracing along the wood. "Moved," she said quietly. Pritchard shifted uneasily. "Well, yes, I told you I moved him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "you moved him." She glanced at him briefly. "But did you move the chair?" Pritchard hesitated. I don't recall." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened just slightly. No, she said softly. I rather think you would. A pause. Then, because the chair has been positioned with some care. The room stilled again. Alina stepped closer. What do you mean? Miss Marple gestured lightly. The angle, she said. Not toward the fire, not toward the door, but toward the window. The constable blinked. So, Miss Marple straightened slowly. So, she said gently, one must ask why. Silence. Clara shook her head faintly. That doesn't mean anything. Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, in my experience, people rarely place things without reason, particularly when attempting to create a scene. Pritchard frowned. I just put him in the chair I didn't think about. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Exactly. She turned, slowly, her gaze moving past them all to the window. The curtains hung partially drawn, the mist outside pressing faintly against the glass. Miss Marple stepped closer. Very gently, she reached out and pulled the curtain aside. The faint moonlight filtered in. And there on the glass, a mark, faint but unmistakable, the impression of a hand pressed from the inside. Alina inhaled sharply. Soft gasp, what? The constable stepped forward. Is that? Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, her voice was quiet, measured. Not a smudge, she said, not incidental. A slight pause, a deliberate contact. Clara stared at it, her voice trembling. I don't understand. Miss Marple turned back slowly. Her eyes moved across the room, once more. Taking in everything, reordering it. And now, she said softly, we must reconsider the sequence one final time. The constable let out a faint groan. Mutters under breath, there's more. Miss Marple gave him a small, sympathetic smile. Only a little, she said. Then her gaze settled very deliberately on the space beside the chair, on the position of the body, on the angle of the arm, and finally on Clara. My dear Mrs. Harrow, she said gently, when you left the study. You said you went upstairs. Yes, Clara whispered. I did, I swear I did, Miss Marple nodded faintly. And when you returned, you found your husband already seated. Yes, Miss Marple's eyes softened, but he was not yet dead. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. Clara blinked. I what? Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm, almost kind. He reached the chair himself, she said softly. Weak, disoriented, but still alive. Alina's breath caught. The handprint. Yes, Miss Marple said. He moved to the window, perhaps seeking air, perhaps seeking help. The room seemed to tighten again. Pritchard swallowed. But when I saw him, he had already collapsed again, Miss Marple said. The constable frowned. Then that means that the final act, Miss Marple continued quietly, did not occur in the study. Her gaze shifted, slowly, to Beckwith, nor entirely before Mr. Pritchard arrived. Beckwith's expression stilled, perfectly, dangerously. Miss Marple's voice lowered. Because Dr. Harrow lived just long enough to reach this chair and this window. A pause, the ticking of the clock grew louder. And just long enough, she added softly, to encounter someone else once more. No one spoke. No one moved. Then very slowly Miss Marple lifted her eyes and fixed them on Beckwith. Which means, she said quietly, you did not simply ensure the outcome, a breath, barely audible. You witnessed it. The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, something shifted again. Beckwith did not answer at once. For a moment he stood perfectly still, too still, like a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him is not as firm as he believed. His eyes flicked ever so slightly toward the wind, toward that faint handprint, and then back to Miss Marple. You're suggesting, he said slowly, his voice measured but thinner now, that I remained after the fact. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. Not suggesting, she replied. Observing. The constable shifted, his grip tightening again. If that's true, then you were with him when he died. A silence followed, heavy, expectant. Clara's breath hitched. Whispers, Julian. Beckwith exhaled through his nose, a faint, controlled sound. Soft sigh, he was already dying, he said. Miss Marple did not look away. Yes, she said quietly, but not yet dead. Alina stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. What did he say? Beckwith's gaze flicked to her just briefly, then away again. Nothing of consequence, he said. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. Oh, I think it must have been very much to the point, she murmured. Beckwith's jaw tightened. You see, Miss Marple continued, a man in such a state, confused, weakened, frightened, does not waste his final strength on trivialities. A faint pause, he speaks of what matters most. Clara shook her head weakly. No, he would. He wouldn't have said anything. On the contrary, Miss Marple said gently, I believe he tried very hard to say something. Her gaze drifted back to the window. To leave a sign, she added softly. The constable frowned. The handprint? Yes, Miss Marple said, not merely a mark of movement, but an effort. Alina's brow furrowed. An effort to do what? Miss Marple turned, slowly, her eyes settling once more on Beckwith. To indicate, she said quietly, who stood before him at the end. The room fell silent again. Beckwith's composure held, but just barely now. A faint flicker of irritation of something sharper passed through his eyes. That is pure speculation, he said. Is it? Miss Marple replied softly. She stepped closer, not confrontational, not aggressive, simply certain. You arrived earlier, she said. You listened, you waited, you intervened when it suited you. A slight tilt of her head, and then, when you believed everything had been resolved, you remained. Beckwith said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and precise. You returned to the sitting room, you saw him still alive barely, and in that moment he saw you. Clara let out a small, broken sound. Sniffs, and he understood, Miss Marple added quietly, that whatever had begun in the study was now being completed. Beckwith's lips pressed into a thin line. The constable spoke more firmly now. Did you give him anything else? A pause, long. Then, no, Beckwith said. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. No, she repeated gently. No, he said again, more sharply. I did not administer anything further. He was already beyond help. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then gave a faint nod. Yes, she said softly, I believe that. The constable blinked. You believe him. Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze thoughtful. Yes, she said, because if he had, there would be signs. Alina frowned. Then what? Miss Marple lifted a hand lightly, as though placing the final piece of something delicate. He did not need to act further, she said quietly, because the damage had already been done. Clara's voice trembled. Then what did he do? Miss Marple looked back at Beckwith, and this time her expression held something different, not accusation, not even judgment, but understanding. You watched, she said softly. The words settled. Beckwith's breath slowed, measured, controlled. Something in his eyes shifted, a fraction. You ensured that no help would come, Miss Marple continued. That no one would interrupt, that no one would hear. The constable's face hardened. You let him die. Beckwith did not respond. Miss Marple's voice lowered. And when he reached the window, when he tried in his final moments to leave some indication, some trace, she paused, her eyes steady. You understood what he was doing. Beckwith's gaze flickered again, just for an instant. Didn't you? She asked gently. A silence followed. Then very quietly, yes. Clara let out a soft, horrified gasp. Gasps, Alina closed her eyes briefly. Soft exhale, the constable straightened, his voice firm now. That's enough, Mr. Beckwith, you'll come with me. Beckwith did not resist. He simply nodded once. Of course. Pritchard shifted uneasily beside him, his shoulders slumping further. Clara remained where she was, her hands trembling, her gaze unfocused. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stepped back slightly, her eyes drifting once more to the window, to the faint handprint, still visible, still speaking. Such a small thing, she murmured softly, and yet so very important. The constable began guiding them toward the door, his movements more confident now, the path ahead clearer, if not simpler. Alina lingered a moment longer, her gaze following Miss Marple's. Do you think he meant it to be understood? She asked quietly. Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Oh yes, she said, Very much so. A pause, then, though I suspect, she added softly, he did not anticipate quite how many people would try to speak over him. Outside, the mist had thinned further, the first faint hints of dawn pressing at the edges of the sky. Inside, the house stood quieter now, but not silent, never quite silent, because even as the footsteps receded, even as the door closed behind them, there remained the chair, the glass, the bottle, and the window, where, in the dim light, the handprint lingered, waiting, as though there might still be something more to say. Miss Marple did not leave with the others. She remained standing by the window long after the constable's footsteps had faded down the gravel path, long after the murmur of voices dissolved into the thinning mist outside. The house seemed to settle around her, as though it too were listening, waiting to see if she would notice what had been left unsaid. Her fingers hovered just above the glass. Not touching, not disturbing, only observing. She murmured softly. Behind her, Alina shifted slightly. She had not gone either. You're still not satisfied, she said quietly. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. Satisfaction, she said, is a rather misleading thing. One can feel it and still be quite mistaken. Alina frowned faintly. You think something's wrong? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that something is incomplete. She turned then, her gaze moving back across the room slowly, deliberately taking in every detail once more. The chair, the table, the glass, the bottle, and then she paused. Oh, she said softly. Alina straightened slightly. What is it? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the table again, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she studied the glass. You see, she said quietly, we have been considering the presence of something. Alina tilted her head. The poison. Yes, Miss Marple said, and its absence from the glass. A pause. But we have not, she continued, considered the presence of something else. Alina's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze fixed on the inside of the glass. Smell, she said softly. Alina blinked. Smell, Miss Marple nodded faintly. It is a most underappreciated detail. People rarely think to account for it, particularly when they are focused on appearances. She straightened slowly, her eyes thoughtful. This glass, she said, was not merely filled with something harmless. Alina stepped closer. Then what? Miss Marple turned her head slightly, her voice lowering. It was rinsed, she said. A silence followed. Rinsed, Alina repeated. Yes, Miss Marple said. Recently, too recently. Alina frowned. Why would that matter? Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Because, she said softly, it suggests that something was in it and was deliberately removed. The room seemed to tighten again. Alina's breath caught. Soft gasp, then he did drink something. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. I think it very likely. But then, Alina began, her voice sharpening, then everything we thought is not entirely incorrect, Miss Marple said gently. Merely incomplete. She turned, her gaze drifting once more toward the study. Consider, she said, the sequence as it now stands. Alina listened, her expression intent. Mrs. Harrow confronts her husband. A struggle ensues. The bottle is taken, perhaps opened, but not yet used effectively. Miss Marple paced slowly as she spoke, her hands loosely clasped. Dr. Harrow is left alive, though weakened. Alina nodded faintly. Mr. Beckwith, Miss Marple continued, arrives or reveals himself and observes. He does not act further, but ensures no help arrives. Alina's expression tightened. And then, Miss Marple said, Mr. Pritchard enters. He finds the doctor still alive, but failing. A pause. And yet, she added softly, between these moments something occurs. Alina's eyes narrowed. The glass. Yes, Miss Marple turned back toward it. Someone, she said, gave him something to drink. The words landed quietly, but heavily. Alina shook her head slowly. But Clara said she didn't, and I believe her, Miss Marple said, and Beckwith denied administering anything further. Alina's breath slowed. Then that leaves, she stopped. Miss Marple did not speak, she simply looked at her. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "Pritchard," she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head faintly. "Yes," Eleanor stepped back slightly. "But he said he didn't touch him." Miss Marple gave a small, almost regretful sigh. "People do so often say things that are technically true." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Technically?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He may not have intended to kill him. May not have understood what he was doing." A faint pause, but he did interact with him. The room seemed to shift again. Eleanor's voice dropped. "You think he gave him something without knowing what it would do?" Miss Marple's gaze rested on the glass. "I think," she said gently, "that Mr. Pritchard found a man in distress, perhaps struggling to speak, perhaps asking for water." A silence followed. Eleanor swallowed. "Softly, and he gave it to him." "Yes." Miss Marple's voice was quiet now. "From this glass," Eleanor's eyes flicked to it, "and whatever was in that glass," Miss Marple continued, "was not entirely harmless." A pause. "Not at first." Eleanor let out a slow breath. Exhales shaken, and then he realized. "Yes," Miss Marple nodded faintly. "He realized that he had done something irreversible, and so he attempted to undo it." "The rinsing," Eleanor said. "Precisely." The truth settled. Different now, more complicated, more human. Eleanor ran a hand through her hair. "So it wasn't just one moment or one person." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It rarely is." She stepped back, her gaze moving once more across the room. "To harm," she added quietly, "requires only a moment, but to create such a situation often requires many." Eleanor looked at her, her voice quieter now. "Will you tell the constable?" Miss Marple paused. For a long moment she said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the window again. To the faint handprint, still there, still speaking. Then very softly, "Yes," she said, a pause, "but not quite yet." Eleanor frowned. "Why not?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Because," she said gently, "there is still one small detail I should like to be quite certain of." She turned her head slightly, listening as though expecting something. And in the quiet that followed, there it was, faint, almost imperceptible, the sound of a door, not opening, not closing, but shifting somewhere else in the house. Miss Marple did not startle. She rarely did, but she did become very still. The sound, so slight it might have been dismissed as settling wood or a trick of the cooling air, had a quality to it, not random, not natural. A pause, then a faint shift, as though something had been nudged just enough to change its position. Eleanor heard it too. Her head turned sharply toward the hallway. "There it is again," she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head, listening with a kind of quiet patience that seemed almost at odds with the tension in the air. "Yes," she said softly, "and I think this time it would be quite unwise to ignore it." Eleanor swallowed. "Softly, you don't think—" "Oh, I think a great many things," Miss Marple replied gently, "but it is always best to confirm them." She moved toward the corridor once more, her steps unhurried, her posture composed. Eleanor followed, though with less ease, her gaze flicking ahead as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The house felt different now. Quieter, yes, but not empty. The air carried a faint chill, the sort that clings to spaces that have been disturbed and not yet settled again. Miss Marple paused just beyond the study door. Her eyes moved, not forward this time, but to the side. To a narrow service passage, half concealed by a wooden panel that sat slightly ajar. "Ah!" she murmured. Eleanor frowned. "I didn't even notice that before." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It was not meant to be noticed." She reached out and pressed lightly against the panel. It shifted, revealing a slim, dimly lit corridor beyond, bare wood, narrow walls, the sort of passage used by servants long ago or by anyone wishing to move unseen through the house. Eleanor let out a quiet breath. Soft gasp. "You think someone used this?" Miss Marple stepped just inside, her eyes adjusting quickly to the low light. "I think," she said, "that someone has been using it." The air within was colder still, carrying a faint scent of dust and something else, something recent. Her gaze dropped. Footprints, not many, but enough. Faint impressions in the thin layer of dust along the floor, leading both ways. Alina stepped in behind her, her voice hushed. "This wasn't just from tonight." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I think it has been used before, perhaps quite frequently." A silence followed. "Then by whom?" Alina asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she followed the direction of the prints, moving slowly along the narrow passage. One step, then another, careful, observant. The passage curved slightly, then opened just a little onto a small, hidden door, closed but not fully. A faint line of light edged its frame. Miss Marple paused. Her hand rested lightly against the wood. She listened. Nothing, no movement, no sound, only stillness. Then very gently she pushed it open. The hinges gave a soft, reluctant creak. Beyond, a small room, not part of the main house, or at least not obviously so, it was sparse. A narrow bed, a chair, a small table, and on that table papers. Alina stepped in behind her, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking everything in. "This," she said softly, "is a place for someone who wished to remain close without being seen." Alina's breath caught. "You mean someone's been living here?" "Or staying," Miss Marple said. "Watching, waiting." Her gaze settled on the papers. She stepped closer, lifted one, read, then another. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "What is it?" Alina asked. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she picked up a small object beside the papers, a vial. Similar in shape to those in the cabinet, but not identical. Alina's eyes widened. "Another preparation?" Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes." A pause, and not accounted for. Alina stepped closer, her voice tightening. "Then whoever was here had access," Miss Marple finished quietly. She turned then. Slowly, her eyes moving back toward the doorway, toward the passage, toward the house beyond, and the people who had just left it. "All this time," she murmured softly, "we have been considering those who were present." A faint pause. "But not," she added, "those who were unseen." Alina's breath slowed, her voice dropped. "Miss Marple." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Yes," Alina swallowed. Whispers, "If someone has been here watching all of this." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple said very quietly, "I rather think," she paused, her eyes drifting once more to the vial in her hand, "that they have not gone very far." Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She did not rush to the doorway, nor did she make any sudden movement that might betray urgency. Instead, she placed the vial back on the table with deliberate care, aligning it neatly beside the scattered papers, as though tidiness itself might coax whoever had been here into revealing themselves. Alina stood very still behind her. Whispers, "What do we do?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, listening, not for obvious sounds, but for the absence of them. "We wait," she said softly, a pause, but not passively. Her gaze moved again to the papers. She picked up one sheet creased, hastily folded, and smoothed it open. The handwriting was uneven, pressed too firmly in places, lighter in others, as though written in agitation or secrecy. "Ah," she murmured. Alina stepped closer. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the lines, her expression sharpening just a fraction. "These are not accounts," she said quietly, "nor correspondence of a usual sort." A faint pause. "They are observations." "Observations," Alina repeated. Miss Marple nodded. "Of Dr. Harrow, of his habits, his visitors, his conversations." Alina's breath caught. Soft gasp, "Someone has been watching him." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "very closely." She turned another page, "and not just him." Alina leaned in, her brow furrowing. "Who else?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked up briefly. "You," she said. Alina froze. "Me." Miss Marple inclined her head faintly. "Your return to the village, your letter, your meeting with him." A gentle pause, all noted. Alina swallowed. Quietly, then whoever this is knew everything. Yes, Miss Marple said, or very nearly everything. She set the papers down, carefully, thoughtfully, then turned slowly back toward the doorway. The passage beyond lay quiet, still, but not empty, not truly. You see, she said softly, when someone observes so diligently, they do not simply stop. Alina's voice dropped to a whisper. You think they're still here? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she took a small step toward the door, then another. Her gaze fixed not on the obvious spaces, but on the edges, the shadows, the places where a person might linger just out of sight. And then she stopped. Oh, she said softly. Alina's breath caught again. What is it? Miss Marple did not look at her. Her eyes remained fixed ahead. There, she said quietly. At first, Alina saw nothing. Then a shift, barely perceptible, at the far end of the passage, a shadow that did not belong to the wall, a shape that had been still and was now moving, slowly, deliberately. Alina's hand flew to her mouth. Gasped softly, "Who's there?" she called, her voice unsteady. The movement stopped. Silence fell again. Miss Marple stepped forward, not quickly, not threateningly, simply forward. "I think," she said gently, "that it would be far better if you came out." A pause. Then a voice, faint, roughened. "Better for whom?" Alina stiffened. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "For you," she said softly. The shadow shifted again, and then a figure stepped into the dim light. Thin, pale, clothes worn, though once of decent quality, eyes sharp but tired. Alina stared. I don't know you," Miss Marple, however, inclined her head slightly. "No," she said quietly, "but I believe I know of you." The man let out a dry, humorless sound. Quiet chuckles strained. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "though not by name, at least not yet." The man's gaze flicked briefly to the room behind them, to the papers, the vial, the narrow bed, then back. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet," she said, "you left the door not quite closed." A pause. The man's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Perhaps I did." Alina's voice was tense now. "Who are you? What is all this?" The man looked at her, really looked, for the first time. And something in his expression shifted, recognition or something like it. "You're Alina Finch," he said quietly. Alina's breath caught. "How do you—" "I know everything that happens in that house," he said. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Yes," she said softly, "that much is quite evident." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple added, "And I think you have been waiting for this night." The man did not answer, but he did not deny it. Alina took a step forward. "Waiting for what?" Miss Marple's voice lowered. "For something to go wrong." A pause. "For the truth to force its way to the surface." The man exhaled slowly. "Sighs weary truth," he murmured. "That's a dangerous thing in a place like this." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Only to those who fear it." The man's eyes flicked to hers, sharp, assessing. Then he spoke, quietly. "You think you've uncovered everything, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no," she said, a pause. "Not everything." The man's expression shifted again, something cautious. "Then what's missing?" he asked. Miss Marple's gaze dropped briefly to the vial on the table, then back to him. "You," she said softly, the word hung, unavoidable, unanswered. The man's jaw tightened slightly. Alina's voice trembled. "Miss Marple, who is he?" Miss Marple did not look away from the man. Her eyes remained steady, observant, quietly certain. "That," she said gently, "is precisely what I think he has been waiting to tell us." The man did not answer immediately. For a long moment, he simply stood there in the narrow passage, the dim light catching the hollows of his face, the sharpness of his gaze. There was something in him that did not belong to the house, and yet had clearly lived within it for quite some time. Miss Marple did not press him. She waited, patiently, because she knew people like him always spoke eventually, when silence became heavier than truth. At last, he let out a slow, tired breath. Sighs low and worn. "My name," he said quietly, "is Arthur Bell." Alina frowned. "I've never heard of you." "No," he said, "you wouldn't have." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "But Dr. Harrow would have." Arthur's eyes flicked to her. "Yes," a pause, "I was his patient," he continued. "Years ago, before any of this, before her, before the arrangements," his voice faltered slightly, then steadied. "Something went wrong." Alina's breath caught. "Whispers, the incident," Arthur nodded faintly. "He called it a miscalculation," he said, a faint bitterness creeping into his tone. "Said it was unfortunate, unavoidable. A quiet, humorless chuckle, but I lived." Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. "And not entirely as before." Arthur shook his head slowly. "No, not entirely." A faint pause, "but I learned something from it." "What?" Alina asked quietly. Arthur's eyes hardened. "That men like him don't stop." The words settled into the room like cold air. "He continued his work," Arthur said. "His experiments, his preparations, always pushing, always adjusting." He gestured faintly toward the vial. "Always believing he could control the outcome." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "And you remained to watch?" "Yes." "Why?" Arthur hesitated, then, "Because no one else would," he said simply. A silence followed. Alina looked shaken. "So you've been here all this time just watching?" "Watching," Arthur said. "Listening, learning." A faint pause, waiting. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "For what?" Arthur met her gaze. "For him to make a mistake he couldn't hide." The words echoed faintly in the small room. "And tonight," Miss Marple said softly, "you believed that moment had come." Arthur gave a slow nod. "Yes." Alina stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Then why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you help him?" Arthur's expression flickered, something like pain crossing it briefly. "I tried," he said quietly. A pause. "I was in the passage when the argument started. I heard everything." His jaw tightened. "I was going to intervene, but then—" He stopped, his breath catching slightly. "Quiet exhale, I waited too long." Miss Marple said nothing. Arthur continued, his voice lower now. "By the time I reached him, he was already weak, confused, and then the others came." He glanced briefly toward the house. "One after another, each making it worse." Alina closed her eyes briefly. Softly, "Oh." "I stayed hidden," Arthur said. "Watched it unfold, watched them, each thinking they were in control." A faint, bitter laugh, but none of them understood what they were dealing with. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the vial. "No," she said softly. "They didn't." Arthur stepped slightly closer now, his voice steady again. "I knew what was in that bottle," he said. "I knew what it could do, especially in the wrong combination or the wrong condition." A faint pause by the time they were finished. It was already too late. A silence followed, heavy, final. Alina's voice was barely a whisper. "So all of them together?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Each played a part." Arthur nodded. "And none of them truly understood the consequence of their actions." Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Which," she said gently, "is so often the case." The room fell still. For the first time since the night began, there was a sense, not of resolution, but of something settled, not neatly. Not comfortably, but truthfully. Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze moving back toward the house. "The constable will need to hear this," she said softly. Arthur nodded. "I'll tell him." A pause, then, "And then?" Alina asked. Arthur gave a small shrug. "Then I suppose I'll finally leave." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then inclined her head gently. "Yes," she said. "I think that would be best." They moved back through the passage together, the hidden door closing softly behind them. The house, once so full of tension, now felt quieter, not peaceful, but emptied of something, as though whatever had been building within its walls had finally broken free. Outside, the first light of dawn had begun to touch the edges of the village, soft and pale against the fading mist. Miss Marple stepped onto the gravel path, drawing her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders. Alina lingered beside her. "Do they ever learn?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, some do," she said. A pause. "Eventually." She glanced back once more at the house, at the windows, at the place where so many intentions had collided and unraveled. Then she turned away, slowly, calmly, as though it were simply another morning, another mystery, another reminder that in quiet places the most complicated truths often lie just beneath the surface, waiting patiently for someone to notice. And if you've stayed with this story until now, perhaps you noticed more than you expected. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave your one comment below. What you think really mattered most in this case.